Hi, I'm Mary Margaret McAllen, Director of Special Projects at the Whitty Museum, welcoming you to Session 7 of the Conference on Texas Resilience, Past, Present, and Future. Today we will be having this session online instead of in person, our normal box luncheon session, due to COVID-19 precautions. So I hope you enjoy on your personal computer or at work or wherever you are. Today, we will be hearing from experts on the Texas Liberators of World War II German camps, which occurred at the very end of World War II, and a lot of them were from San Antonio, in fact. Today, we'll be hearing from Elisa Wong, Alisa Gunn, Steve Rosenblatt, and our moderator, Ed Westermann. Many special thanks go to our presenting sponsor, the Elizabeth Huth Coates Charitable Foundation, and our session sponsor, Veltri and Velasquez Wealth Management of Wells Fargo Advisors here in San Antonio. Hope you enjoy.
How do you do? Welcome to the Texas Liberators of the German War Camps 1945 panel, sponsored by the Whitty Museum. I am Professor Ed Westermann. I'm a professor of history at Texas A&M, San Antonio, and I'm also a commissioner on the Holocaust and Genocide Commission for the state of Texas. I'm delighted to be able to host this and moderate this panel today. I have 3 speakers, and I'll introduce all of the speakers at the start of our discussion today, and they'll be introduced in the order in which they speak. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Elisa Wong, who is a professor of history at Texas Tech University. She is a specialist in modern Italian history with a concentration on Southern Question discourse, race, nationalism, and identity. Her book, Race and Nation in Liberal Italy, 1861 to 1911, is available from Palgrave Macmillan. She teaches courses on Europe and World War II, nationalism in Europe, popular culture and history, history of Italian fascism, and the history of the Italian mafia, as well as graduate seminars. She is also the recipient of numerous teaching awards and is a member of the Teaching Academy at Texas Tech University. Our second speaker today is Miss Alisa Gunn, who was born and raised in San Antonio. She is currently a sophomore at Alamo Heights High School. Ella's hobbies include traveling, painting, reading, cheerleading, and being outdoors. She has a passion for history for as long as she can remember and hopes to continue studying it. Her former history teacher, Jessica Kuntz, really impacted Ella's passion for the subject, specifically topics surrounding World War II. Ella had the honor of laying the wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C. in 2019. Our last speaker is Dr. Stephen Rosenblatt, who has been practicing nephrology in San Antonio for over 40 years. He is originally from Washington, D.C., a graduate of Vanderbilt University in Nashville and the Weill Cornell Medical College in New York. He did his postgraduate training at UCLA and the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio in internal medicine and nephrology. He was a United States Air Force flight surgeon. He has been a docent at the San Antonio Holocaust Memorial Museum for the past 3 years. He feels an obligation to speak about the Holocaust because of his mother and father, who were able to escape Europe at the beginning of the war. So without further ado, Dr. Wong, if you would please start.
So thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction. My name is Elisa Wong. I'm from Texas Tech University, and I serve as the interim dean of the Honors College here at Texas Tech. I, several years ago, had the great fortune of meeting Pete Berkowitz, the former chair of the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission, who approached Texas Tech University with a very unique project. He had with the Institute of Oral History at Baylor University, worked to collect a series of interviews with Texas liberators, people who had been there within the first week or couple weeks of liberation of the concentration camps in Europe after the Second World War. And he had these interviews, he had these oral histories, he had these narratives of soldiers, of nurses, of doctors, of people who had lived that experience and yet had never spoken their truth, had never necessarily spoken and come forward as witnesses to the Holocaust. And he wanted to make sure that these testimonials, these witness statements were available to students across the state of Texas, to people across the United States, so that we could never again deny what had happened was a human tragedy, was a human travesty, and needed upstanders, needed people to speak the truth, speak honestly, and to prevent this kind of human cruelty from happening again. So the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission asked Texas Tech to take on this work. And so taking these pieces from the Baylor Institute for Oral History, several colleges and several schools across Texas Tech University worked to create something that initially started off, Mr. Berkowitz asked us to do, started off as a project that was supposed to be just an electronic book. He wanted something that was just not a book. It was not just something that was static, but was something that younger students, the newer generation could actually pick up, hold, click on, interact with, engage with, and really become a part of as well. And so as we began to develop this, we began to think about what it would mean to really bring the history of the Holocaust and the history of liberation to middle and high school students across the state of Texas. So with the help of these colleges and schools, with the help of faculty, staff, undergraduate and graduate students, we started what we now call the Texas Liberator Project. So ultimately, we decided that an electronic book, although they serve their function, was not the best way to actually engage with these younger students. So what we decided to do was to go digital, was to actually begin to think about the ways in which young people interact with artifacts of history. And that may be right through actual reading of books, going through documents, visiting Holocaust museums like the Whitty Museum, where you can actually go interact with panels, listen to testimonials. But many students may not have access. They may not be able to visit San Antonio or Dallas or Houston and visit those Holocaust museums, or to be able to go to Washington, D.C., to go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So what we could do was to begin to whet that curiosity, begin to engage by taking it into their homes, taking it into their schools. So one of the first things that we thought of was, what does everybody have? They have their phones, they have their computers, and they have their iPads. And so we wanted to create an app where students could actually enter into this historical moment, but while respecting the historicity and respecting the documents, the narratives in that particular moment, and honoring both the liberators, the survivors, and those who did not come home to us. So what did we do? We sent an architect from the College of Architecture at Texas Tech to Dachau, where he went and visited the facilities. He met with the archivists, he received the blueprints, and we created what you see here, which is a 3D modeling of the camp of Dachau. If you visit Dachau now, many of these buildings are no longer standing. Much of it is falling apart due to its decades of climate change. Many of these barracks no longer stand. But what we did was we recreated to scale, using even the correct trees, the correct grass, the different types of buildings, in order to allow students to visit virtually Dachau, even if they were not able to step foot in it themselves. And by creating this, we were able to transport students into this moment so that they can not only visit and engage with the historical artifacts that we have, belt buckles, letters home from soldiers, testimonials from liberators, testimonials from survivors, but also begin to understand what visually that would look like. We then created this web page, which is an educational resource for students. So not only can you go in and interact with our website. So for instance, under the interact, you can have a description of what is going on. You have a teaser trailer that I will show you at the end of this presentation. There is a walkthrough, an app user guide, and you can actually launch the app and move yourself through this process of liberation. But we also have interactive maps. So that, for instance, map of Germany, if you were to click on one of these buttons, you could actually open up one of these concentration camps, and you could see the information that we have gathered of these liberators, of the honor roll of our liberators, and the information that we have of what rank they served, their service description, what units they served in what branch of the Army. But in order to make this useful for everyone in the state of Texas, we also have an interactive map so that you can, for example, scroll down to San Antonio. You can click and you can view the liberators from the city of San Antonio. And therefore, people could go to the local archives, they could visit their museums, they could do Ancestry.com, they could go through and actually begin to understand who their own heroes were, who the people from their hometowns were, and begin to really engage with who these liberators were as people. So who were these liberators? Originally, we started with 19 liberators that the Institute for Oral History of Baylor University collected. And then we added 2 more that were collected by the Holocaust Museum Houston. But these were what we want to get across to these students, especially our students who are at the university or who are in the junior, senior of high school. Many of the men that were sent to fight in the Second World War, they were ready to fight. They were trained to fight. They crossed the ocean. Many of them had never left the state of Texas, had never left their hometowns, and they were ready to engage in the battle. They had gone through basic training. They understood what they were up against. They understood what they would face. But they did not know what they would see when they entered upon these concentration camps. And what we want to instill in these young people is that these same young men who for the very first time had never gotten on a train, never gotten a boat, and who some of them, went on a big boat, landed on D-Day, doors open up and in the middle, right, of the Atlantic Ocean, and fighting for their lives, fighting the Battle of the Bulge in weather, the coldest weather, digging down into the earth in order to gather warmth so that they can keep their bodies warm. That these young men were 18 years old, 19 years old, 20 years old, the same age that they are when they are sitting in a senior high school classroom, when they are sitting in a college history classroom, that these young men and these young women could be them. And to begin to understand the transformation that must take, the reckoning that must take place. And so in our project that involves not only the app and not only the website, but a museum exhibit and a book, we talk about these men. So one of these men is Robert Anderson. And he is near and dear to my heart because he was actually a professor at Texas Tech University. He was a professor of psychology, and he was one of the pioneers of dyslexia and of understanding the tools for working with dyslexia and creating educational alternatives for people who suffer from dyslexia. But Bob Anderson, before he became a professor, was a soldier, and he fought in the Second World War. And what he has to tell us echoes with what many of our high school and college students know from a novel about the First World War. And I want to share his thoughts.
Outside Theonville, which is a very lasting, uncomfortable memory. We didn't have a lot of heavy clothing. We were getting it gradually, but we had, as a wireman, you had to go out and work with your hands, so you had gloves. And I lost a glove, and there was no other glove, so I was without a glove. So we were parked on a road in the convoy, and I looked over there, and there was a whole pile of soldiers, dead soldiers. They just lined them up on the road, and then they were waiting for the mortuary trucks to come and pick them up. But they were mostly German soldiers. There was one American who was from our division, but the night before had been killed. So I went through those looking for gloves. I found a glove. I took it from a young German soldier, and on his belt, he had "God is with us." But didn't But my thought was, Jesus, I've been praying to God all my life. And here's my enemy with the same thing. It didn't make sense. It didn't make any sense at all.
Bob Anderson only told that story once to the oral historians at Baylor University. When we opened the exhibit at Texas Tech University, unfortunately, Bob Anderson had already passed. He had passed a month before, and his son had come into town, and he saw us busily putting up our museum exhibit, and we had used the photograph of his father as one of the promotional posters for our exhibit. And he came to us and he said, "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake. My father was never a prisoner of war." And we had to tell him, it wasn't your father who was a prisoner of war. It was your father who liberated prisoners of war. He had never told his son the story that he was a liberator. We have men like Ted Hartman, who was a tank driver, who talks about Jewish survivors coming out and kissing the front of the American tank, who later became one of the first deans of the School of Medicine at Texas Tech Health Sciences Center, because he wanted to continue to help people. Men like Wilson Canifax, who served as a spiritual advisor and who met Elie Wiesel when he organized a Jewish worship service for the survivors at the camp. We have people like Ben Love, a Houston banker, philanthropist, who gave so much, but only spoke once of his story. One of our collaborators, one of our graduate students who worked on this project, the person who made many of the films for us, for the app, he is now a cancer survivor, and he went to MD Anderson. And when he was at MD Anderson, he saw a statue of a young man, and underneath it read Ben Love. And he texted me, he said, "Is this our Ben Love?" And I said, "Yes, that's our Ben Love." Because after he helped to liberate the camps, he then helped to liberate people from cancer by philanthropic works. These men came home transformed. These men came home with a new understanding of what life meant. These men became bankers, gas station attendants, doctors, professors, finance people, teachers, but they were also human. And they came home with post-traumatic syndrome. They came home carrying this weight with them. And what we hoped to do was to capture these stories so that they could do what ultimately they wanted to do towards the end of their lives. And this is why we juxtapose the pictures of their service photos with their photographs, with their portraits today. Because they served as liberators when they fought in the Second World War. They serve as witnesses of the Holocaust in their senior years. So we wrote the book, and George H.W. Bush gave us the foreword, and we honored people, including soldiers from San Antonio, like George Wessels, people like Gerd Milner, and we continued to talk about what this means. So this app, the website is available to everyone, and we want to leave with this call to action, this call to be an upstander, and this call to never forget, but to always remember.
Do you ever wonder where truly horrible things begin? The unimaginable emerges slowly, like a hungry death. We weren't ready for this.
And that's the Texas Liberator Project, which you can find at www.texasliberators.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wong, for a fascinating presentation. At this time, Alisa Gunn, will you please speak?
Yes, thank you. My whole life, I've grown up hearing stories that have been passed through generations about my family history and origins. And so hearing these stories has really helped me make connections with historical events I've learned about. An event I've always been especially interested in is World War II. So when I found out that my great-grandfather was one of many who liberated the concentration camp Dachau, I was eager to learn more about it. So my great-grandfather, Curtis Conway Gunn Sr., otherwise known as Pop, was born July 30th, 1911, and died September 3rd, 1999. He worked in the service department at Smith Chevrolet in San Antonio, Texas. And along with many other men in the automobile industry, he was recruited to serve. Since these men knew automobiles like the back of their hand, they were recruited to service tanks in General Patton's army. Records indicate that Pop served from July 27th, 1942 to December 7th, 1945. And then these two certificates show his records of service. This is his draft registration card. He served in the 13th Armored Division under General Patton and was Lieutenant Colonel. He's received 3 battle stars and a Bronze Star in the European theater. The battalion traveled through Bavaria and Austria and liberated the concentration camp Dachau. Dachau opened in 1933 and was the first concentration camp. It started with taking in political prisoners, but later this group of prisoners expanded to Jews, Germans, and Austrian civilians. By April 26, 1945, there were over 67,000 inmates at Dachau. Hearing news of the approaching Americans, the German SS guards desperately forced 7,000 of the inmates to leave on what would become a death march. On April 29th, as the American troops approached the camp, they discovered over 30 railroad cars filled with decomposing bodies. This was just a small preview of the horror that my great-grandfather, Pop, would discover at the camp. His experience in liberating the camp was so horrible that he did not talk about it. What we were told was that he had been forward deployed to set up a fueling and service depot for the tanks. And while they were traveling through the woods, he was part of a group that discovered the concentration camp Dachau. As you might imagine, after the camp had been operating for 12 years, the sight, sounds, and smells would leave a horrific and lasting impression on Pop. Upon entering the camp, the sight of the sick and malnourished people, as well as the piles of dead bodies, was absolutely terrifying. He was distraught as he tried to assist the prisoners, but at the same time, he had to interact with the Nazi camp guards who were surrendering. From what we heard, one of the German SS officers surrendered directly to Pop. So since Pop did not want to relive this experience by talking about it, we have relied on the clues which are the artifacts that he brought back. These were items that the SS guards had used to maintain control of the camp. Bringing them back was symbolic of the liberation of the victims and the defeat of the evil perpetrators. With these artifacts, you'll notice the repetition of the icons of the Nazi regime, such as the swastika, the Nazi war eagle, SS bolts, as well as an orange-yellow color. So on this first artifact, you'll notice the war eagle holding the swastika. Then you'll see the sheath for the knife with the swastika on it as well. The cat o' nine tail used for whipping, another general knife, and then as well as a second model dagger. And we have 2 of those in our family collection. So the 2 colored daggers belong to men of different status. The golden yellow color was in cavalry as well as reconnaissance and belonged to the Hauptmann, which is the captain. And then the other dagger with an orange yellow color was used for military police as well as recruiting and replacement, which a lieutenant or company pennant would have. And then the next 2 artifacts, you'll notice more detailing with the SS bolts and the war eagle with some silver accents, as well as lastly the SS motto engraved in one of the knives saying, "My honor is called loyalty." The liberation of Dachau was a very impactful experience in Pop's life. He came back home as a changed man, and I think that not only did the war itself have an impact on him, but specifically his encounters with the liberation. He had developed a very deep feeling of hatred for the Germans that would last the rest of his life. He did not like to talk about the war, what he did, or what he saw, and he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. The whole experience was very traumatizing. Pop, along with all the men in this war, demonstrated true bravery in the battlefield as well as in encounters like the liberation. He also had to be resilient when he came back home to a normal life. Pop came home to his wife, Catherine Smith, and his children and became a deacon of his church, and then went home to his employment at Smith Chevrolet. 10 years after he came home from the war, Pop broke away from Smith Chevrolet and started his own dealership, Gunn Automotive, which continues to be a family business to this day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ella, for sharing your grandfather's story. And our final speaker today is Dr. Stephen Rosenblatt.
I don't know if it's good morning or good afternoon. I'm not sure when this will be presented. I'm a docent at the Holocaust Museum. I want to thank the Whitty Museum and the Conference on Texas for inviting me to present. Sometimes a little hard to do cleanup but the stories do overlap, and you know, history can be dry, dates and battles and people and numbers. And I think what you've heard and what I'm going to continue is to tell some stories. So I have two stories to tell because I think history becomes real when you kind of feel the stories, see the stories. Waiting for my slides to come up. There they are. All right. So I'm a docent at the Holocaust Museum, and most of the teaching I do will be to middle school and high school students. Occasionally we get adult groups to come through. And since I'm a second generation survivor, not only do I get to tell the history, but I get to tell stories as we go through the presentation. So I'm going to tell you two stories today. So let's get started. The first one is about a family and what happened to them, or to one of them, well, to all of them in the Holocaust. So there's a picture of my mother. She's probably 15 years old at this point. She grew up in Vienna, Austria, grew up in the 2nd District, which was a Jewish neighborhood. She went to private school. Her father was a jeweler. So I have a feeling they lived a middle class, maybe even upper middle class lifestyle. The point of what I'm trying to make about her, she's 15 years old. She weighs probably no more than 100 pounds. She's probably still a little girl at this point. And in March of 1938, at the Anschluss, when Germany marches into Austria, not one shot is fired. The Austrian government capitulates, and Germany claims Austria, a German-speaking country, as being part of Germany. Now, all of a sudden, she is thrust under all the Nazi Jewish restrictions, the armbands, where you can sit. You're no longer allowed to go to school. You can't work if you're a professor. If you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're no longer allowed to work or teach. Here's a picture of her father in front of his jewelry store, picture of her mother, another picture of her father, but what I wanted to show you is some of his handiwork as a jeweler. And we only have 3 pieces that we're able to get out of Europe. And this is a woman's compact. It had a mirror inside, and just a representation of the kind of handiwork that he could do. So March of 38 is the Anschluss, the takeover of Austria. And in November of 1938, there's a night called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And that's basically a pogrom. The word pogrom comes from the Russian word gromit, which means to destroy by acts of violence. And it was a term applied to these systemic riots that the Tsar promulgated all through Russia, through the Ukraine, and his police and his soldiers would go into the towns and into the little shtetls, the little villages out in the countryside, and they would just one night start pulling the Jews out of their houses. They would rob their stores. and it was so prevalent. It happened so frequently in each town. It happened in so many towns that in the 1880s and 1890s, over 1 million Jews got up and left that area, many of them immigrating to the United States. In fact, as a side note, I'm up in Crested Butte, Colorado, and they had mines up here, and there was a Jewish community up here at that time. These pogroms recurred again in the 1910s, and they again were so prevalent and so virulent that close to 1 million Jews got up and left again. So in November of 1938 is Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in Germany, which includes Austria now, and over 250 synagogues throughout Germany are burned to the ground. Stores are looted, as you see represented here. Our holy books, this is a synagogue that had been destroyed. You can see it must have been a grand structure prior to this event. And our holy books were brought into the street and burned. So this is a pile of Torahs of Scrolls. It contains the Old Testament, the 5 books of Moses, written in Hebrew. It takes a scribe about a year to do the lettering. If he makes a mistake, a single letter, it has to be perfect. He can actually remove a little piece of parchment, lift it up, and then apply a new letter. Here's another representation. So during the year, we read this from one end to the other and then start again at the end of the year. And this serves as the basis of our religion and the rules that God presented to Moses. From that is how we guide our lives. So on Kristallnacht, the books, the Torahs, the prayer books, the interpretive books, what's called the Talmud, they're brought into the street and burned. So there must have been a synagogue on my mother's street, and there was a fire in the street outside her window. Sometime that night, she snuck down to the fire and pulled a piece of parchment out of the burning mass of books, and she placed it in her Bible. This is a Bible written in Hebrew and German. It was the way she studied and learned her Judaism. And she closed it up, and she kept those burnt pages in there until about 15 years ago, when my brother and I saw them for the first time. This was the only possession she had when she got to the United States, except for the clothes on her back. She showed us these fragments. They were interesting. We didn't know quite what to do with them. My mother died about 5 years ago, and we rediscovered this. We decided that if we put this back in the attic, this would get lost, and we decided to donate it to the U.S. Holocaust Museum. Much to their surprise and to our surprise, when they saw this, they reported to us that these fragments were only one of 3 such known fragments that exist in the world. One set of them being at the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, another set at Frankfurt, and these pages at U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington. They've told us that they're working on a temporary exhibit. It can't be on permanent exhibit. Apparently it's so fragile that prolonged exposure to light, it will deteriorate. But they're trying to see if they can find a way to show this for a period of time. Now, getting back to my mother. So it's November of 1938. Sometime after that, her parents, who had been from Poland and had Polish passports, decided to go back first to Czestochowa, where they were born and met, but they ended up in Warsaw. And by leaving Austria and going to Poland, they got out from under the Nazi rule. However, as we all know, on September 1st, 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland. Poland falls within 30 days, and all of a sudden, they're back under Nazi control. The Nazis quickly and swiftly began to sequester the Jews in areas called ghettos. And they kept concentrating the Jews in a smaller and smaller area. There were close to, I've heard, 350,000 to 450,000 people pressed into a small area of Warsaw with restricted movement. It didn't matter where you lived, you just had to move to the area they told you, to where they told you to move. It wasn't until April of 1940 that the Warsaw Ghetto was completely sealed off, but you really couldn't move in and out of it very effectively. My mother, who's about 15, 16 years old, is now caught in the Warsaw Ghetto. And she really told us very few stories, as we've heard. These people who experienced this weren't willing to speak freely about this. So these are a couple of stories she told me. One is she couldn't stand crying of the babies who were hungry. So she would go out at night, drop into the sewers, get out of the ghetto, and I don't know by what means, she would bring bread back into the ghetto for the children. Somehow the American consulate in Vienna in 1939, in the fall of 1939, gets a message to her parents and her in the Warsaw Ghetto that if my mother can get back to Vienna, he has a visa for her. The reason for that being that my aunt, her sister, had gotten to the United States about a year earlier and had been able to process one visa for my mother, but not for their parents. So my mother now has to travel by herself at age 16, 450 miles across German territory to get back to Vienna. She only told us a couple stories. We don't know how she did it, probably walked most of the way. She said she comes to a bridge. Okay, well, let me go backwards first. Her parents realized that all three of them tried to get out of the ghetto. They're going to get caught because they did not have permission to travel. So they dressed my mother down, put ponytails on her, made her look younger than she was. And I want you to remember, she kind of grew up a very sheltered person. She was just a child almost at this point. And they told her to find her way back to Vienna. She comes to a bridge. There's a Nazi soldier there. She said she was terrified. She didn't know if he would kill her, if he would let her cross, if she should try to bribe him. Somehow she gets across that bridge. She comes to one of these borders indicated on the map that I've placed before you. And she can't cross through the normal border crossing. She doesn't have the paperwork to do that. So she has to cross through the woods at night. But she's not crossing alone. She's crossing with other people. Gunfire breaks out. They all start running. Next to her is a mother running with a little baby in her arms. The bullets are flying. A bullet hits the mother. The mother drops the baby. The mother drops to the ground. The baby hits the ground, is crying and wiggling. My mother is running, and she says, I could not stop to pick up the baby. I couldn't do it. Now, I don't know. I didn't know what PTSD was. I hadn't heard about it until probably 20 years ago. But in retrospect, my mother had PTSD. She rarely smiled. She didn't laugh easily. I don't think she was always happy. I think she went to bed every night crying about not helping that baby. She gets to Vienna. She goes to her apartment. Someone has confiscated their apartment. She's told if she wants to, she can live in the basement by the heater. She has to go out during the day and forage for food. She has to report to the SS while she's there waiting for the American consulate to process her paperwork. She has to report to the SS. She walks in, and you can kind of imagine the German commandant with his high collar and all the doodads on his chest. She stands before him, and she said he would take his gun out and put it on the table in front of her. And she would have to report what she was doing in order to get her visa. So this is her passport. She is called, at the top you can see it says Staatlos, stateless. That's because as a Jew, she was not a German, she wasn't Polish, she wasn't anything, she was stateless. This is the visa that was issued by the American consulate, Donald Brown. And I want you to pay attention to the dates, because when my brother and I looked at these dates carefully, we began to understand what an absolute survivor my mother must have been. So you see the date is February 3rd, 1940. On this page, sideways, unfortunately, on February 5th, she's able to get the Nazis to give her permission to travel from Wien to Rotterdam, from Vienna to Rotterdam. 2 days later, she has to go 650 miles. As I tell the kids, she didn't buy an airplane ticket and go, directly. She couldn't get on the Acela and go directly quickly. She had to buy a ticket to Salzburg, get off the platform, show her paperwork. Every time she's terrified, are they going to accept her paperwork? She's 16 years old. Is she going to be safe? Is she going to be violated in some way? And then she has to find her way to Munich. And then from Munich, maybe to Frankfurt and Köln on the way to Rotterdam, each time getting off, showing paperwork, She said it was absolutely terrifying. However, if you analyze these various border stamps, she leaves Vienna on February 5th. She's in Rotterdam by February 11th. She finds a boat and she's out of Europe on February 11th. Now, I don't know how to take a bus across town San Antonio, and she figured out how to go 650 miles and get a boat in 5 days, and I think that was a remarkable feat. She was a very smart woman. She wanted to become a doctor. That didn't occur, obviously. I think she was happy when I became a doctor, but I know she was ecstatic when her granddaughter became a doctor. This is a picture of my mother, probably before she left Vienna, and her sister. Her sister greets her in New York. She goes to high school in New York, but she's already knows chemistry and physics and math to a higher level than American students. She really just needs to learn American history and English, so she goes through that rapidly. But she told one more story, is that when someone would knock on the door of their apartment, she would run into the bathroom and lock the door because she was afraid they were coming for her. Second story, it's interesting because we've seen a lot about Dachau, and I'm about to tell the last part of my talk about Dachau. So we've already been introduced in this video of what Dachau looked like, which actually helps me in my talk here. And you've already been introduced to Gerd Milner. Gerd Milner lives in San Antonio. He is one of the Liberators. He came to the United States. I got permission to tell the story from his wife. Apparently Gerd is not capable of doing these things, but about 5 years ago he gave this talk, and I've echoed this talk in my lectures at the Holocaust Museum. So in about 1935, he comes from Germany to the United States. He got out early. He goes to school. He ends up getting drafted. So of course he's bilingual, and they put him into Army intelligence. He is with our troops in June of '44 when they hit the beaches at D-Day. He has been now with soldiers from June until March and April 1945. These are hardened soldiers who have seen the worst of war, who have seen their buddies killed. They've seen people been dismembered. They have been wounded themselves and returned to action. And they've been doing this for at least 9 months, and it's getting close to the end of the war. So Mr. Miller is in Munich, and he gets a phone call from his commander. He says, "We just found another one of those damn camps. I need you to go out there and help out and see what's going on." So Gerd gets in an open Jeep with a driver and an aide, and they drive the 18 kilometers from Munich out to Dachau. And as they get close, they begin to smell something that's terrible. And that smell gets stronger and stronger as they get closer and closer to the gates. Now, seeing the gates is deceptive. You know, it says, Arbeit macht free, work makes you free. The whole process of the concentration camps was to keep the people subdued, even in the midst of their misery. And here we've already seen the virtual front of Dachau, but this is it. And it's March, and you can see these trees here in this picture are starting to green up a little bit, and I suspect the same thing was happening when Mr. Miller got there. And he says as they approached this gate and got closer and closer, the smell got stronger and stronger. Now, it looks pretty clean and upright when you see this entry gate, but when he got inside and saw American soldiers, he saw American soldiers, battle-hardened soldiers, who'd been through the worst of everything, sitting on the ground vomiting. He saw American soldiers crying because of what they were seeing. These are some of the survivors, 70 and 80 pounds, who had survived anywhere from 2 to 4 months, maybe longer, on 180 calories per day. You saw that avenue with the barracks on both sides. Okay. You saw that avenue with the barracks on both sides. And if you walked inside and you looked in the bunks were stacked 2 or 3 high, you saw paper-thin bodies stacked one on top of each other who had died there in the camp. And you walked back, and it was in each one of those barracks, that's what you saw. When you got to the back of the camp, there was this train that had 2,500 souls on it, almost all of whom had died with few exceptions. The train must have come in at about the time when most of the Germans escaped out the back door, and they didn't bother to unlock the doors and left the people in there to die. And it took another day or two until the Americans got in there to see what was going on. So this is a story. This is what it looked like. I think history can be dry, but the stories can make it real. This is a picture of another story, but I'm not going to go there. And I thank you very much for allowing me to present today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rosenblatt. Thank you to all three of our speakers, not only for your stories and what you shared, but also for sticking to the time, which allows us an opportunity not only to ask a couple of questions in my role as moderator, but it's been said that history as personal experience has been mentioned here in every one of the presentations we have. And I think that's very important to remember because as professional historians, history starts literally with the individual. And I think sometimes we forget that. And all three of these presentations give us an insight into the importance of individual experience. The other thing that I think is important in overview is we're talking about Texas Liberators, and certainly the U.S. Army has its own Liberators, but the Soviet Army in Poland, occupied Poland, that actually reached, for example, Auschwitz in January of 1945, and some of the locations of the extermination centers there, and British and Canadian forces that liberate camps, and many of the same stories that you heard here that Texans had. That's very much the experience that you have of other nationalities in liberation. So the two questions that I would like to offer for the panelists to discuss, we've talked about trauma, and certainly post-traumatic stress disorder has been mentioned. The trauma of the liberators, which is in many respects very, very interesting, and it ties to the trauma of survivors. We know that Holocaust survivors in many cases did not tell their own children their own stories. I've talked to a number of survivors and their children, and they very late learned about their parents' stories as a result of that silence and trauma. And that trauma was pretty profound, as Dr. Rosenblatt talked about. General Patton, for example, when he visited the camp at Buchenwald with General Eisenhower, Eisenhower asked him to come into a barracks. And Patton, blood and guts Patton, said he couldn't do it because he would be sick, literally, to go see those individuals who would wasted away in those barracks. So I think that I'd like to, if I could, ask each of you to talk about a little bit about that personal idea of how you think it impacted individuals that you talked to or individuals that you worked with. And my final question would be also for Dr. Wong in this case. Could you talk a little bit about some of the technological challenges that you faced in putting together a kind of a multimedia depiction of what Dachau looked like and the experience of the liberators? So let me do it if I could. Dr. Wong, if you would start, then if we could have in the order that we presented, Ella, and then Dr. Rosenblatt finish off.
So, Dr. Westermann, if I can start with your last question about the technological challenges. You know, it is always a challenge as a historian because we work, you know, as at the university at very scholarly levels, and so we work a lot of times in very technical material. Very much working with the documents and speaking at a level of detail that I think that when we're introducing the concept and the conversation about the Holocaust and about liberation to middle and high school students, that may divert people away from the study. And so that was part of our concern, was how we in fact do something that is very technical, very scholarly, but also would reach out to a multiple of levels, multiple of learning levels, multiple educational levels. But we started off, I mean, and that was one of the challenges, but we really started off with, okay, so how do we respect survivors? How do we respect the people who did not come home? Because we did not, you know, and again, you know, most Holocaust museums, one of the first things they talk about is how do we exhibit, how do we show, how do we evidence the amount of devastation, death, starvation, Some of the liberators described some of the people they saw, some of whom were alive as 45 pounds, an adult male at 45 pounds, and some who were dead who were nothing more than, skin and bones, right? And so how do you talk about such a traumatic moment while being honest and real and true to the history, while also respecting and protecting the emotional well-being of children who are learning these concepts and children who are learning this material? So we chose in the app not to show any bodies. We chose that in the app we would have, and so there's a little avatar soldier who goes and talks to different people and asks certain questions. And as a historian, it was really important to me that we didn't make this a simulation, that we weren't playing the Holocaust. So when the little avatar goes and asks someone, what's happening here? What's going on? I don't understand what I'm seeing. What happens is we actually bring up the testimonials of the liberators or the testimonials of survivors and allow them to use their own words to describe the scene, to describe what they experienced, to describe what they lived through. And therefore, we are bringing together the best of what a museum also brings together: testimonial, video, artifact, technology into one larger schemata. And so it was a delicate play. It was a delicate balance because we wanted to be respectful at the same time that we wanted to be educative, and at the same time that we wanted to portray the seriousness of the situation. And so I think that's a good segue into talking about that level of trauma, because we wanted to talk about trauma without traumatizing the students we were trying to reach.
Wonderful, thank you. And Ella, could you talk a little bit about either your parents' relation with your grandfather in this respect, or your own relationship?
Yes, sir. So really, my great-grandfather did not want to relive his experience by talking about it would really, I think, trigger all the emotions that came with the liberation. And I think so he never talked about it to anyone. And the way we got his stories was actually from, there was a driver for something that he always took, and the driver eventually got the information out of him, but that was the only person he ever told about his encounters with the liberation and everything that happened in the war. And so I think it definitely had an impact on him for the rest of his life. And it was just so traumatizing. He did not want to bring back those memories with what happened.
Well, thank you. And Dr. Rosenblatt.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I've been making a few notes. So the impact on my family and me is that I think the Holocaust has had a daily presence. Okay. Even my wife was born in a displaced persons camp, and all of her family's friends were Holocaust survivors. Many of my family's friends were Holocaust survivors. I mean, I remember seeing tattooed numbers as a child, 5, 6 years old. I mean, when I have an hour to tell stories in history, I mean, I tell lots of stories about my father's escape. I forgot to mention that my mother's parents, who stayed in Warsaw, were deported to Majdanek and died in Majdanek. So, my mother grew up as a 16 years old and lost her mother at a very early time, and that obviously had a lot of impact on her. I gave a lecture to Hallandale Middle School, 750 middle school kids. I gave this lecture with the slides, and I tell the stories, and I thought one of the best questions I ever got is afterwards a young lady comes up to me and says, well, how many stories are there like this? And my spontaneous answer, which I'm usually not good at coming up with the right answer, was I said 6 million of these stories. I don't want to leave with the impression that Patton was too overcome with the Jewish problem. I think if you read about him, you'll find that there's another aspect in of him that is very negative. So I'll mention that. And then I liked what Ella said was interesting, how Mr. Gunn, Pop Gunn, or Papa Gunn, however you refer to him, I'm sorry, how he confided in his driver. And it's interesting, our housekeeper would tell us stories because she would sometimes go over and help my mother with her house. So we learned a little bit through the housekeeper. And then when my mother was in an assisted living area, we had to eventually get some health aides for her. And she would tell, in her slow dementia, she would tell stories, and it was, she wouldn't tell us, but she was comforted in telling someone outside the family. So, I mean, the bottom line is the impact. I mean, we're up here in Crested Butte, Colorado, and we have friends over, and somehow on 2 out of 3 times, we start talking about our experience as children of Holocaust survivors. It's just part of our life.
Well, great. Thank you. And I think it's important to point out that most of those survivors who were liberated at the camps were not Jews in Germany. They were actually political prisoners and others, because the great majority of Jews had already been killed in the East or on the death marches. So actually only about 100,000 of those liberated. So it again speaks to the Nazi mania in the Final Solution. And your point certainly about General Patton and a well-documented history of anti-Semitism. But I would say that as a combat commander, I think it again speaks to the conditions that they found. The last question that I would have for each of you then, if I could, is what was the most surprising thing or the most revealing thing that your research in these projects have led you to find?
Originally, when I found out that I was doing this, I didn't really have much like physical like documents or anything. So we had to go through archives and find that. And so whenever we did find it, there was a lot of documents. And so it was really fascinating to go through and like look at all the documents he had to go through in the war. And we found a box of his artifacts at my grandparents' house, actually. And I honestly, just itself, like looking at the artifacts and knowing that these came from Dachau and were used by SS guards, and like the detailing on it that was definitely the most interesting part to me, because you don't see that every day. And it was just, it's crazy to think about where that came from and how those were used in the war. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Rosenblatt, then, the most interesting or revelatory thing that your research has uncovered for you?
Well, I did a roots trip about 3 years ago to Poland to see where my family was originally from, Częstochowa. So of course we visited Auschwitz. And the revelation at Auschwitz was that it was really a factory, and that there were 42 factories, German factories, that moved to use slave labor. And it didn't matter if you died in 2 or 3 months, they just used you while you're dying. And the revelation of how the Nazis and how the industry took advantage of slave labor. The other story that just was almost too much to accept, there's a German insurance company that still exists now called Allianz. And it provided fire insurance to the barracks, to the Germans, for the barracks in which the inmates lived in case they burned down, so they'd have the money to rebuild the barracks. That was just, it was business as usual. It was too much to understand.
Well, that's a fascinating insight, industrialized mass murder. And one of the revelations that I had in looking at Auschwitz is that some of the SS guards were allowed to bring their families, and their families with their children visited them while they were at the camp. So you actually had normal life, quote unquote, of these SS guards even bringing their loved ones to the camp, which is almost beyond belief. I want to thank again all 3 of our presenters for their interesting presentations and for the insights that they shared with us and the time that they took. I also want to thank John Gomez from JSAV, as well as the Whitty Museum, for having hosted this panel. and we look forward to being able to do this sometime again in the future in person and to have all these fantastic panelists back. So thank you very much for your time and your efforts.